Today on the Perception and Action podcast, Perception and Action Journal Club number 5. How can we apply the principles of representative learning design to more effectively train at home in our backyard? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I'm joined by Marianne Davies and Stuart Armstrong to discuss how the principles of representative learning design can be applied when training at home to make practice more enjoyable, engaging, and effective. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Perception and Action Journal Club. I guess we're not really talking about a paper so much as this time, but I'm joined by two people you've met before, if you've been to these ones, Marianne Davies. How are you doing, Marianne?
I'm really good, thank you. Yes, we'll be glad to see that I've escaped from the bunker.
Yeah, hanging out on the golf course. Maybe she's going to show us some tricks. And Stuart Armstrong, how are you doing, Stuart?
Hi, Rob. Good to be back, and very much looking forward to seeing Marianne's new skills.
Yes. So the idea of this, and this is Marianne's idea, I think, first, that a really good one is to try to address the challenge that a lot of people are facing right now of trying to keep training for their sport or whatever at home, this isolated environment where they don't have maybe no teammates, no coach, no the same equipment they're used to. How can we, think of ways to train in this environment? Not just giving up and doing nothing. Can we think of creative ways to train in this environment? And particularly, can we take kind of a principled approach from it using, the ideas from representative design and representative learning design? I think that's kind of what we are thinking. And then, so maybe talking kind of generally about what these ideas are, then maybe getting into some specifics of creative things we've seen or some specific ideas for specific sports skills and so on. Is that kind of what you were thinking, Marianne?
Yeah, definitely. I think I've noticed that there's been almost two opposite things happening. Some people are sort of getting pulled into drills and really prescriptive things, and using gadgets to get ever or ergos to get ever more precise drills set, and then other people have gone the other way and are doing sort of like being really creative. And I thought actually it might be, and there's all this bombardment of information and ideas being shared on social media. I just thought it'd be really useful to just explore maybe some of the principles behind kind of, what maybe good practice would be outside of the normal context.
Yeah. How about you, Stuart? I know I've seen you post videos. You're doing a lot of this yourself, right? With your kids and trying to, what are kind of your thoughts to lead us off?
Yeah, I guess, you're often limited a little bit by either the space that you have. Some people are indoors; they haven't got an outside space that they can access easily. Some people are more fortunate, got a garden. Others are more fortunate, like Marianne; they've got an entire golf course to be able to play on, but you can't be out there all the time. And so, there are limitations, but it's around. I suppose what I've been, exploring and then hopefully sharing is to apply some of the principles where possible and where I can remember to record them as well, because often I'm a participant, which is quite difficult, to then, just try and apply some of these ideas and then share them with others so that they can use them as a little thought or an idea for themselves, and then they can then build off that. And so, I've just been exploring a few of those ideas, both individually and then in, more sort of 1-to-1 or 2v1 or 2v2 type stuff, because unfortunately my wife gets roped in to make the teams even, so we try and create a few dynamics there, and she's involved in some of the experimentation as well.
That's cool. I think we've been talking a little bit around this idea of representative design in last week on the emergence group, and the one of the kind of points I was making is, part of good coaching is, I think, deliberately making things not representative, right? So if you have everything perfectly represent the game or what you're trying to train, you're not coaching, right? You're watching your athletes play, right? So I think part of good coaching is isolating things, sampling from the environment. So that's a bit different than what we're talking about here. Part of the reason you move away from perfect competition is to train and develop skill. Here we're doing it more because out of necessity, I think, because we don't have the environment. So I think that's a good point. And I like you too. I've seen a lot of different things people are trying and some interesting ideas. So maybe we can jump right into the idea of representative design and talk about some of the kind of the key concepts, and then kind of connect it with what we've been talking about. So I pulled a quote out of one of the papers we looked at. I'll read it. So to attain representative learning design, practitioners should design dynamic interventions that consider interacting constraints on movement behavior, adequately sample informational variables from the specific performance environments, and ensure the functional coupling between perception and action processes. So I think there's three so we want the information to be similar, right? Especially the term we use is specifying, similar to what the athletes are going to use to make decisions, to control their actions. We want it to be similar in the practice environment to the real environment, as best we can. We want to have action fidelity. We want the movements you perform to be similar to what you're going to perform, to involve the same type of complexity, same coordination issues, degrees of freedom issues. And then coupling, my favorite one, maintaining perception action coupling. And then the other one, which I think the authors have added on later in later papers beyond this, is the emotional pressure kind of context of practice, right? Making the stakes as representative as you can. So I think that would be the fourth one for me. So maybe I was saying before we came on, one of the things I see a lot of people talking about is this challenge of having the information that's in your practice representative of the real thing. And so maybe where do you start with that, as Marianne, when you're designing a practice activity?
Okay, so one of the things that we were just chatting very quickly before we came on was for me, I want to try and understand what their level of ability is, what they're trying to achieve, and then from there look at what the information is that would support those behaviors. So if I give an example from the sort of sports I'm involved with, in a lot of adventure sports, beginners will often be prioritizing balance. So if I talk about climber to begin with, they're going to prioritize balance, not movement efficiency. They want to stay on the rock in between the movements. So the information that's specifying to them at that moment in time might be very different from the information that would be specifying for an elite climber. So that would be the first thing, is trying to work out what information they're paying attention to, and what it is that they need from that information. And again, this would be interesting to see what you think. If I'm working on a climbing wall, I'm more interested in the way in which the holds have been put together than I am in whether they look and feel like real rock. So, and if I explain that, so if I'm working with beginners and my pet hate is a climbing wall that's got massive handholds and tiny footholds for beginners, because although that just encourages them just to hang off their arms, it doesn't encourage to take weight on the feet and transfer it. So I am more interested in what the information is available, what it does to support the sort of movement patterns and decisions that they need at that moment in time. Am I making sense there?
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes I talk about this issue when it comes to VR. I call it functional or psychological fidelity. Like, I care more that the practice environment produces a similar behavior. Doesn't matter if they're climbing grass, rock. That's superficial, right? You want the behavior you elicit to be similar. Yeah.
And that's, I think, why we're able to play around with things like different size tennis balls or bats or heights, because that actually we can, and again, with beginners, we can change the behavior. So for example, in fact, some environments that are perfectly representative might actually have too much variability for a beginner. So we want to dampen that down a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a great point. The information is different at different skill levels. Yeah.
So a slower ball for tennis, for kids, and scaling is scaling of the behavior as well as just the actual.
Yeah. What about you, Stuart? What about this information? I guess for your side, you probably think more about it as much about decision making, information from decision. How do you think about representativeness of information?
So one of the challenges, obviously, is one of the sources of information in order to maintain representativeness is other humans in a team sport context, and more often than not, in a team sport context, there's more than one, and so how they act to a certain extent defines how the performer might act. And when you're essentially robbed of that, you then are looking to you're sort of forced to work in a slightly different way. And so what I've been looking at doing is to say, well, how much of that information can we provide, and in what way? So, for example, we might simulate for example, a cricketing concept. So, backyard cricket, if you like, is famed amongst some of the research as being, particularly if you look at some of the stuff in Australia, they've all played backyard cricket. And in all of these backyard cricket games, there are various ways in which the information is put in place. So, for example, you might create a series of imaginary no-goes or actual no-go zones, but what they are imaginary fielders. Mm-hmm. So, we, for example, have a limit in our garden that if you hit the ball in the air on a particular side, it goes into the neighbour's garden and you lose the ball and it's the end of the game. So obviously that's one thing that you're not allowed to do, hit the ball in the air. So we're constraining a little bit to say you must score by hitting the ball in gaps along the ground, and then we'll put imaginary fielders in. And by moving the imaginary fielders, I can, to a certain extent, encourage either of my children who happen to be playing, who might have preferred shots to play, to try and score in some of those areas. So what I'm trying to do is to use objects, and they're not ideal because they're inanimate, but in our minds they're fielders. And I actually use mini football goals because they've actually got nets, and so they actually capture the ball. So they create a sense of the ball being caught, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And the gaps are the places that we need to score in. Now, traditionally, what people might do is use the goals as targets to score in. I choose to do it the opposite way, to create the imaginary idea of the football goal being the thing we try and avoid. We're trying to hit gaps. Gaps is what we're looking for. Mm-hmm. So that's the specifying information in a cricketing context. And then when I'm doing something, for example, with, say it's a game that we're playing something like a football or a field hockey or something along those lines, it's, okay, well, what can we do with an opponent if it's just one? What can we do with an opponent if it's two? What can we do if it's an opponent, if it's an older brother or a younger sister and they've got different capabilities? And how can we take advantage of our each individual capabilities to try and create some kind of a game that gives a bit of challenge? So the other day, for example, playing field hockey in the back garden, it was Mummy, Evan and Isla, my two children, versus me. Mm-hmm. Just want to say that I won by some margin, but that's not important. What was important was the challenge created.
Yeah. No, I really like that. I like that you've recognized. So when we talk about information, right, we can get super specific, like tau, we can do math and geometry, or, and that probably more appropriately in this kind of situation is just general, like you say, space is the gaps, is the information, rather than, you don't have to necessarily get out your diagrams and figure out exactly what information people are using. I was saying to someone the other day, I think not necessarily in this situation, but in normal practice situations, I kind of like to use what I call diagnostic practice. So I'm varying the conditions, not really to develop the athlete, but for me to figure out what they're using, what their kind of control laws are. Do they always pass the ball when a person gets too close to them? Do they always attack when the space is this size? And that's when video can really help you as a coach. So you just kind of put them in different situations and you try to figure out what are the information variables that are driving decisions, driving behaviors. And then maybe you want to change them. Maybe you want to make sure they're in the practice. But I like that idea. I like those ideas a lot, Stuart. And I think it's important, you're right, having the obstacle is catching is going like a fielder is a good idea as well. But I think that's the way to start. Marianne, did you have?
No, I was just thinking that actually, essentially, both what Stuart and I are talking about is creating environments where they have to sample different ways of doing things. So which you kind of also fits in that diagnostic thing, doesn't it? So with the climbing wall, you want to set a bouldering problem or a challenge, or even on the water that gets the athlete or the participant to sample different solutions. Mm-hmm. And I also use that diagnostics very much in the same way you've described, and it perhaps just because I'm not sure what it is that needs to be worked on, so I'm going to experiment with some different things and have a good look. But sometimes there are solutions that have been used a lot. Quite often, actually, it'd be interesting to see what you think. Quite often, the ones that are more problematic are things that are old school, perfect technique. Mm-hmm. They haven't come across them accidentally, but they've kind of been drilled in at some other point. And then I go, okay, then maybe the first thing I need to do is just disrupt that a little bit and then see what I get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like that. And then a couple of things that come to mind when you guys were both talking is one of the things, I think I would call what you're doing, Stuart, is kind of making crude versions of the actual information that they use. I think we've talked about, I think when we had our conversation a while ago, what we want to avoid is having them make decisions and act to completely different information. Like, that's not going to be there at all, because that's the kind of end of the thing we don't want to go to, right? So if you're not going to be able to create the information perfectly, like you said, when you don't have as many players in the same environment. But what we don't want to do is create a negative kind of transfer situation where we use lights or some other abstract thing. I think that's what we want to try to avoid when we're stuck in a situation like this. Yeah.
And also, you're often having to just make do with what you have at hand. Mm-hmm. The resources that you have. I mean, if we're talking about this, essentially, let's call it the backyard scenario, but also inside. We play hall hockey. It's not the most popular game in the mm-hmm. household, but it's really narrow, and so that requires. You've essentially got a space the width of the stick, right? So that requires you to actually manipulate the ball in a certain way to be able to try and get past somebody else. So that's quite a challenging game, but that's just because we're using the space or the narrowness of a particular corridor, and it also happens to be that the flooring and it's the place that you can do least damage in the house. So it kind of works on a number of levels. But just to think very practically through some of these situations, what do you have? Now I've been called on Twitter this week by, in fact, one of the parents of the children I coach cricket as a kit hoarder, because actually I have realised how much kit I've got. There is quite a bit in the garden, so I'm fortunate that I can use various different forms. But I've amassed this stuff over the years because, I've wanted to be able to play. And then the other thing that's probably important to mention here is that sometimes I'm probably sacrificing what you might call some of the information variables and some of the action fidelity, because of the constraints of the area. I know we're moving on to that in a minute, but also I'm entertaining as well. So I'm trying to eke out some learning and something that's relevant for them by not just doing something that would have very little relevance. Like, for example, pass them a ball and, there's an object behind me and I'm going to try and dribble around it. We're not going to do any of that. But what we are going to do is create a scenario where we might receive a ball, bounce the ball ourselves, use a tennis ball or something, receive it, and then Daddy's here and you've got to try and go around Daddy, because at the very least, having another human who might do things that are unpredictable creates some of the information that would be relevant in the area. So that's, I suppose, just in the design element, just trying to create an element. Tyler Yearby used a really interesting phrase the other day. I don't think it was on our session last week, Rob, but it was on when I was talking to him, where it's a slice of the game. And you can make the slice as wide a slice or as narrow a slice as your environment or what you have at hand determines. So I suppose that's quite a nice way of thinking about it. How much information is there is defined by what your resources and the environment that you're within, and also a little bit of what it is that you want to develop or help to develop, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I like that. The one I use other people use a sample from, but I like the slice. But I think the analogy of a slice is good too. If the real environment is a cake, right? Yeah, you could have as small a piece of cake as you want, but just make sure it's cake, not pie, right? Right?
Yeah,
make
perfect.
Sure it's not from a different environment. I think that you can, as long as you got a little bit there. But so, I think that's a good point. The other thing I like is, if you think about in all of this in terms of the constraints, which you were kind of getting at, Stuart, is, we can think about kind of general constraints that affect almost all sports, constraints of time, space, speed, distance. We can get around with those, maybe not in the way that they're going to happen in the competition, but we could play around with those, in this environment, training at home, giving kind of athletes new constraints and having them adapt to them. I think that's another way you can think about this. Marianne, did you have another?
No, I was just thinking about the, what that slice could contain, and actually just thinking about some of the stuff that I did as a kid in the backyard. And I remember doing things like playing rounders with a stick that we'd whittled and like rolled up socks if we couldn't find a ball, or a dog ball that had been chewed. It doesn't look anything like anything we're going to play a game with, but there was still lots of exploring, sort of different, different sort of perception action search spaces, if that makes sense. And that, and I think one of the things that would be interesting to think about is learning to, as an athlete, learning to sample the search space if it's different, which is slightly different from becoming familiar with the search space. Am I making sense there? Mm-hmm. They're actually exploring all these rather, random things. And again, I loved, sort of your chat with Alex last year and other people with the sort of, the backyard games where, there might be a neighbour's greenhouse in one place or a window in another, so they're definitely no-go areas and you get constrained about these things. But also just the kit that you've got available as well. But when they change, the athlete is learning to sample those different search spaces and slightly different relationships, and I think if people are thinking, I don't have any of the right kits, I actually think you'd probably be better off doing something that's just a little bit more imaginative and maybe not quite the same, but that is exploratory and is has got some validity in and of itself than going towards doing some kind of repetition movement pattern that's out of context of any kind of environmental information or outcome.
And that's actually, I think that's what this current situation in many ways affords, because you're constrained not only by the space that you have, but also the equipment or whatever it is that you might have around you. You are required to become more inventive, and you will design activities based on by using. I've been playing around with almost creating lots of hybrid games. So today, in fact, we just came in from a bit of a marathon session where myself and my son invented basically a hybrid version of tennis and squash against the side of the house. And what's interesting about that was we were using the wooden paddle bats that you get at the beach. You normally play with like a kind of a sort of squash ball, but we were playing with a tennis ball. And the weight of the bat is such that actually it doesn't really propel a tennis ball that well. So generating power is an interesting action. You have to sort of hit it in a certain way. And in the end, we constrained the space in such a way that we had a relatively limited wall to hit at, and then we created outlines. So the rallies lasted longer because the way to win the point, became more difficult. But also, my garden has got some potholes in it dug by our dog Flo. And actually, we became quite adept at making the ball go off the wall and land in what was called the hole of doom, because then it would have a crazy bounce and you'd have to adapt to that. And it could quite often win you the point. Now, okay, what's that got to do with either tennis or squash? Not a great deal in reality, apart from the fact that there are rackets and a ball. The ball is bigger and it bounces more. But what it did do, it was a form of entertainment, but it was actually helping, and I was watching him start to react to shots. So I was starting to play little drop shots. He's reacting to those. He's playing little deep shots to try and force me back because he knows maybe my lack of mobility might be an advantage for him. So he's starting to get a little bit tactical. It's quite interesting how we just explore it. And then what we have to do is create a different scoring system because, of course, I've got an advantage by being, older and a bit more powerful. So he has to score 7 to win and I have to score 11 to win. And he won 1, I won 1. We had a close game, and that made the game more fun and created a bit more pressure and challenge. And by the end, there was one game where I was on 10 and he was on 6. So the next point, and he goes, "Oh, is it? Do you have to win in 2?" I said, "No, it's sudden death." He goes, "Oh, that's really funny." It's these kinds of dynamics that I'm thinking are interesting. And when it comes to the sort of specifying information, we're playing almost like a hybrid version of 2 games, but basically it's just a racket game. Where we're limited by space, so we hit against a wall, and then actually we can get a pretty good game going. We haven't got enough space for a decent game of tennis, but tennis squash hybrid game. Now we've got something we can play.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mary.
That you're having to work out what the specifying information is. So you're doing that search for information and search for solutions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if this could bring in the idea of, this idea of a donor sport. This is almost like a donor activity, right? It's, do you think like the general, doing solving a motor coordination problem in a highly variable environment it's almost like learning how to learn, right? We know that transfers between subjects in school. I don't know, if that transfers between sports, giving people solving, maybe it's a completely different kind of activity. You don't want it too different, maybe, similar racket sport or something, but maybe this having to solve motor coordination problems is something that can, transfer or help you if we can't do your exact sport.
I mean, one of the things I suppose I kind of like doing, Rob, and this is where I maybe slightly go away from some of the theoretical side, is I'm actually quite happy to almost I guess, sort of divert from what might be an ideal through the purpose of doing just a little bit of discovery for myself, really going, right, what would happen? Here's some kit we've got. What can we do with this? Right, let's invent something. And then through a process of modifying the constraints a little bit, either through space or equipment use or whatever it is, or rules or whatever, by doing that, almost saying, well, what is it we can do then that might give this some element of realism or some element of value from a movement perspective. But there's another dynamic to this, and it goes back to this point about entertainment, which I think is really important, which is, both of my children, we're both my wife and myself are working, so we're trying to balance the childcare and all that sort of stuff. So the reality is, at the moment, that during some periods of the day, the children are sort of entertaining themselves. Now, my daughter's very creative. Her grandmother's taught her lots about craft, so the house is full of craft stuff. You would not believe it, like literally everywhere, glitter, glue, everything. But my son, like a lot of teenage boys, is finding a way to connect with his friends through the medium of video games. Mm-hmm. And if he was allowed to, would probably spend quite a bit of time there, becoming quite an expert in various hypercars through playing various different games. But if I'm honest with you, I'm challenging myself to design these activities because I want him to go, Dad, can we do that game again? Mm-hmm. Because I need something that's going to be as attractive as that. And so I'm happy to sacrifice a little bit of some of the representativeness of stuff if it means that it's going to give the entertainment factor, if that makes sense. But where possible, I'm always going to use some of these principles, information, action fidelity, and perception action coupling, which we'll talk about in a minute, to try and design an activity that is as fun as it possibly can be, and yet having some value either through exploratory movement or because it has some relevance to a sport-specific activity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I like that. So I think I was trying to talk, I think at the start, sometimes I think we think about this in the wrong direction. We ask, how representative does it have to be? We always say as representative as possible. So I always think the goal is to try to get as close to the real thing as possible. Whereas I think it's better to think of the slice analogy, or deliberately breaking, but being principled about why you're not doing it. I'm not doing this like the game because I want to enhance this affordance. I want to make it more entertaining, right? So deliberately moving away from the real thing rather than trying to get everything as close as possible. Like good coaching is violating the representative. I think that's part of what being a good coach in a principled way. So I think that's a good, definitely a good point there.
Yeah, and we've talked about those reasons that you might violate or that you do violate are things like maybe to disrupt patterns that are dysfunctional that have been picked up, maybe to make the specifying information more obvious and easier for them to connect to, maybe to make that relationship between what they're doing and the outcome more obvious, so making a learning environment higher validity for somebody at their stage of learning. There's loads of reasons, aren't there? There's loads of things that we would do that I think are more important than just thinking, does this look exactly like the game? Does this look exactly like the eventual performance environment?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. What about the coupling issue? How do you try to do that in some of the things you're doing? Obviously, I think you've talked about trying to, keeping decisions in and changing the setting. But how do you guys think about that?
So I'll give you an example of something I explored a few weeks ago, which is interesting. So again, this isn't necessarily a sport-specific activity, albeit it is semi-based on that. So taking inspiration from, say, activity like parkour, which we talked about with Ben Strafford some time ago with Marianne, and parkour as being a potential. His PhD is about parkour being a potential donor sport for other activities. And one of the interesting things about parkour is there isn't necessarily an opponent to deal with, but there are problems to be solved by virtue of the environment through which you're trying to move, and ways in which you might have to make judgments about distance you can cover, or ways of landing and safety and what you're capable of doing, and all these sorts of things. So using parkour as an example, pulling out all the garden furniture and spreading it around and basically creating an obstacle course. Now, one way of doing an obstacle course we started off with was, we called it Ninja Warrior, because obviously that's a reference for the kids.
Cool.
Yeah. And creating what was actually really quite a health and safety nightmare of with an obstacle course, but it was fun nonetheless. And creating a bit of time pressure by allowing them to score their own time and trying to beat their own time. That was one way. But then I decided to flip it. So we played chase tag. So I created the area and created chase tag, because now there's a responsibility to respond to the movement of another. And that's got a little bit more of the information in it and perception as well. So they're moving that way. Where do I need to move? How can I get there without going over this obstacle or around this obstacle? What would be the shortest route? What could I do if I jump over that? Can I get there? Would I be able to escape if I go into that space? And then throwing in, me throwing various balls at them. And if one of them gets hit by the ball, they have to freeze and do some kind of action movement just to create some entertainment, but also something else to think about. So I suppose the perception action bit I'm trying to create within what is essentially a game that doesn't necessarily require a great deal of perception action coupling, but I wanted to create some, because then the movements were different. It was very interesting. When it was a timed run, they were acting. I was still trying to create choice. You can go that way or that way, which might be the best way. What can you do? That's a shorter route, but more difficult. What about if you stay there? But when it was against each other, the movements changed. They were more dynamic. They were more. There was a lot more evasion happening. There was a lot more thinking of, I can't go there because they'll get me. I'll go there. There was a lot of, I'm going to dodge. I'm going to stay. I'm going to move. And then it was really interesting to see the strategy that came into it as well. And that's an example, I suppose. Again, not an invasion sport game, but a more obstacle-based activity, but trying to create the opponent element to that to give it some different dynamics.
Yeah. No, I really like that. And I think that reminds me of, I think one of the things we could think about right now is this is a great opportunity to develop, in the lingo of the ecological dynamics, the effectivities, right? Action capabilities, our speed, our strength, our agility. But I still think you can use these principles of perception instead of doing wind sprints down in your backyard. We can do it in a functional, coupled way, because I think the key for me is, agility and speed and all these have purpose. They have functions. And like your example, we keep that intact. For me, that's a way better way to train. But you could move your focus of the design and practice away from developing skills so much as developing these raw action capabilities is another way I think we could take advantage of what this affords the situation. Yeah.
Well, there's a couple of messages I've just seen in the chat box.
Okay.
From Joey, which I think kind of we were picking. I'm just sort of doing there, and actually maybe some of what you're talking about sort of fits in with that last one. That if you do just have a wall, then that maybe some of the movements and the things like putting obstacles up and the type of stuff that Stu was doing can be much more effective than the fact that that's not an opponent.
Yeah. So when you don't have anybody at all to play against, 1v0, is using a wall. I think it's a great one. Of the other general things I think this affords is this is an opportunity to go crazy with variability, right? You explore different, like this comment says, different heights, weights, directions. I think that's another thing we can take advantage of. Do almost moving towards a differential learning kind of approach where you're just trying lots of different things and different body positions and things just for the sake of variability. I think that's another possibility in this environment.
And playing around with constraints as well. So, for example, if all you've got is you and a wall, then what you might want to do, or if the player, whether it's you or it's a child, and you're helping the child to design an activity that they're going to do on their own because you can't be there all the time because you've maybe got to go off and do something else, then what you could do is just help them to design an activity that has even just give them a framework around how they could even manipulate constraints for themselves. So you could say, well, all right, why don't you have a go with that ball and see how many you can do when you get the wall. The one thing a wall does is it allows an object like a ball to come back to you, right? So it's got some dynamic mechanics to it, right? So you can then say, well, actually, what if you can get the ball to come back to you, and then you can maybe use different parts of the body or whatever it is to control the ball, right? Now let's start to manipulate that. Okay, so let's try different types of ball. Let's use different sizes of ball, different balls with different rebound properties. Let's use all those things. Let's put some funny obstacles. In fact, it reminds me of the tennis game we played, actually. We had a crazy catch. One of those like springy, like mini trampoline face things that you throw a ball against and it bounces back, supposed to be catching. I hate really because they're not, you just get someone to hit the ball to you. Yeah, it's better. It's more representative. But if you got nothing else, use a crazy catch because it comes off weird, right? So you've got to catch it in a strange way, right? But we actually put it into our tennis game and we called it the Power Bunga. I don't know why. That's just what the name that the kids gave it, right? But if you got a point by hitting it into that, you got extra points. But if you missed it, it dumped it and you lost points. So it was like a bit of extra pressure and stress, right? So we just created a different surface. So different surfaces to bounce the ball off, different balls to use with different rebound properties and different sizes and weights, different areas through which you are allowed to receive the ball. So you've got to kick it in one side and move in order to receive it in another. So that you're developing the action of movement whilst receiving rather than static. So you're just trying to make it as real as you can. Yeah. In that, even if it's massively limited because there's no defenders or anything like that, just give it realism. And then obviously imagining that you've got the defender on your back and all that can help. But even without all of that, just those little bits of differentiation that you're going to use to try and just challenge yourself to think about ways in which you can manipulate the object with your feet or with your knee or with your chest or whatever it might be is fun or can be fun, and create your own records and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also kind of what I think you're hinting at a bit, Stuart, too, is if you're a parent or, there's a couple of you using kind of stories or vignettes like to create a context. Yeah. Okay, this is the end of the game in the last second. And I think there's opportunity for doing that kind of stuff here as well.
I'm aware it's getting a bit dark here.
Yeah, we're losing you.
What Stu's describing there, we always used to call the elimination games. Because you're putting constraints on them by eliminating other options. So classics that we used to do is like playing table tennis. You had to use one hand then the other. So whatever, or football, it'd be left foot then right foot. So as the ball comes back, or this, like Stuart says, you have to move to this place, or you draw, cartoons on the wall, and you've got to hit certain points, in order. So you're eliminating different bits to create some constraints that make it more enjoyable, and again, it get you to search for different solutions. So I like that.
Yeah, and I think a nice point the quote I took from is they are emphasizing the difference between making real decisions and discriminating between things, where you give people obvious choices and they just have to pick one or the other. I think that's a really important point, and right?
Perception of action and perception for action. So that ventral dorsal. Thing. I'm gonna try and move, so you might lose me for a few minutes. I'm just aware that I've disappeared.
Yeah, we'll get into some light there.
But I think that's quite interesting. That what that action capability is of what you're paying attention to.
Yeah. No, I think there's some good, like you said, Stuart. There's keeping some of these fundamental things. But I think you're also right that, we have to recognize not every time you go out in the yard is about developing skill. It's, engagement, entertain, but I still think we can do those in a way that still captures the representativeness. Yeah.
I think though, for me, that's one of the major attractions of, I guess, kind of working through an ecological lens and, utilizing, say, a constraints-led approach, or always thinking, I suppose, in this way is, from my perspective, I see quite a lot of information shared online about what I would call training activities. So, you've got young people, often young people, in these spaces, and they're being trained. They're being trained to move in certain pre-described ways, using objects as fake opponents, I suppose. And it's right, yeah, train this move, repetition, repetition, repetition. So there's no repetition without repetition. It's purely repetition with repetition. And those activities may serve a purpose. I'm not 100% convinced of that, but they may. But in my mind, it's very training, and I would question whether a child wants to go through that kind of a regime willingly. They may, because there may be motivations like, wanting to satisfy, parental engagement, et cetera, but from the perspective of transferability, I do have some questions. However, in my mind, because I'm consciously thinking that I want this to be as engaging as it can be, given the array of other possible opportunities, then there's a part of me then that is thinking always that one of the benefits of utilizing, if you like, the kind of representative learning design philosophy approach is actually what you end up doing is challenging yourself to do stuff which seem, at least on the face of it, to be really quite engaging. Because, I have to actually, when I was a child, the worst moment was dinner time, when the game had to end because it was either dinner time or, as Marianne found, it goes dark. Right? Now, you're onto something when a group of young people don't want to stop playing, but there's another constraint that they've been put in place, i.e. dinner time or darkness. So in my mind, I'm trying to design an experience, and I use representative learning design as an example of that, because it actually creates a more engaging experience. And it also goes in some way towards a learning experience, at least the hope is, or the intent is. And so that's why for me it's like a massive win-win, Rob. I almost feel a little sorry for people who lack the imagination to conceive of, which is kind of why it was so important for me to do this, because I really wanted to talk about it in this way. Because the theory, I think, for a lot of people is really important, and it really is. And when you hear the likes of Sean and Tyler, they're really engaged by that, and I am too. But I'm engaged in it for what it gives me rather than in itself. And I just, not only is it, in my opinion, a better means by which for somebody to become more skillful, but it's actually a really enjoyable way of doing things if done correctly, and that's really, really important for me.
Yeah, no, I agree. I keep saying I think that's why part of the reason this has become so popular, it's not because it's easy to grasp, right? It's definitely not the theoretical concept. It's because I keep saying resonates with a lot of people. It's just, it feels right, and it's fun and engaging. Yeah. What about, in what was the other, so we talked a little bit about action fidelity, trying to make similar. I think you're right. You can sacrifice that a bit in when you're in the kind of backyard environment. We don't need perfect, exact same movements, but I think as long as it's kind of, we get similar coordination, basic psychological. So any other kind of thoughts about? I think the engagement is right. It reminded me. I saw a video today. Someone posted on Twitter of I don't know if you guys saw this. A little tiny kid playing tennis with a coach. And the coach is hitting him balls over the net, and the kid doesn't move the whole time. And the coach is like, "Come on, should you be moving your feet more? Should you be attacking the net?" And the kid's just standing there, letting every ball go by because he's bored out of his mind. But you're right. So I think it is more engaging. Yeah, definitely.
I definitely agree there with that, and I love. I know it's a very Australian thing, that Maslow before Bloom, that what at any time there's a choice, I always want people to be engaged and motivated. But and I think as a coach I try and have in my head that I want the engagement to come from this internal dialogue of, I wonder what will happen if, coming from the participant, rather than that, oh God, I've got to do it like that, or I don't want to make a mistake. And then that to me, I think is the most important thing, because I think whatever they're doing then, they're learning something. So if at the worst case, it isn't the same as the sport they're actually doing, they're still learning to move, they're still learning to interact with an environment, they're still learning that it's fun, they're still learning, like you say, you want to be dragging people in because it's got dark, or something else has happened than get hung up about kind of technique or.
Yeah, and hopefully this is also a little, you mentioned give opportunities for creativity, but I think it's also a bit freeing for people, both coaches and athletes, right? As long as you kind of satisfy these basic principles, like anything goes almost. Any crazy idea for a task, as long as you're not hurting people, go for it, try some variable, watch the differential learning videos. You can't get much crazier than that, right? So just go for it.
Actually, can I just add one thing there? Because I think it's up. And again, that's and I know I've spoken about it before, the idea of validity of the learning environment. I think for me, where I sort of start to question what people are doing is when you've got a practice that is supposedly either some perfect technique or some perfect drill movement patterns. So again, these ergos that are really restricted, they're not they're not moving. They're not giving that information, but also that the objective is to reduce movement variability, and that the only way to know what you're doing is effective is if some machine's telling you that you're being more precise in the repetition of your movement pattern. Mm-hmm. If you're doing something where, whatever you're doing, the ball either goes where you want it to or not, or it goes in the net or it doesn't, or there's this real authentic result that doesn't need a coach telling you if you're being technically perfect. Mm-hmm. I think that's really important in that design, that whatever it is, it's representativeness of what you're doing at that time.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I think, back to Stuart's comparison with video games, you need a specific satisfying goal, right, for the person. Right. That's why one of the reasons video games are so much fun, when you beat the boss or whatever, you have a specific goal. Yeah.
And it's interesting, actually. I was going to talk to you about that, Marianne, around what, kind of people who are in, different sports that, it's easy enough to, kind of play various different ball sports in gardens, but much more difficult, isn't it, to get something that's representative. For example, if you're a rower or you're doing canoeing and all this and the other. So again, this is where people are probably hitting the ergo just to maintain the activity. So you're just training the cardiovascular system more so than you are developing, kind of skill, or you're developing tactical awareness in race. But I guess, is there a role for simulators to be played there? Because whilst it's you're not getting the information from the perspective of things like, balance and the way you might place oars in the water, et cetera, what you are getting is maybe a goal to beat another individual, which might mean you put, more strokes per minute in, or whatever it might be. Is there anything there that has a value?
I don't know. It's an interesting one, and there are definitely different views. And I think where I am at the moment, which might change, is that I haven't seen any ergos necessarily that I think are actually are supporting, the training outcome. Yeah. And actually, maybe that's a good opportunity to do something that takes the pressure off those repetitive movement patterns for your body. So if you're looking at efficiency and VO2 increasing, things like that, then maybe going running or doing something, or going swimming, if you can do that allows you to rebalance the pressure that's being put on your body. Might be more useful than going on an ergo and then just seeing if you can punch out perfect forward paddle strokes, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I can just imagine in those scenarios where you're really constrained by equipment and environment, that it's difficult to be as imaginative. But I still feel like that the principles around representative learning design, representative task design, could be applied with some degree of success. I think you'd have to get quite creative, but I do think there is scope there. But it's interesting about creativity. So, and the reason I asked the question about the use of external sources, and this is where I'd be interested in your views, Rob, particularly with some of the work you've done around technology, is I think we've talked about this the other day, but there's armies of golfers out there, right? Who, you can't buy golf hitting nets on anywhere. They're just like, whoever sells them is making a fortune. Mine's on its last legs. I'm have to fix it together because I'm trying lots of things. But what's really interesting about that is I bought a little sensor that clips on the shaft of the club. It's basically an accelerometer. And it links to either an app on your phone, or it links to a piece of simulation software which you can play off a laptop. Now, it's certainly not ideal, because I've hit some pretty rank shots that have carried quite a way, because it obviously doesn't pick up contact and the quality of strike, but what it does give you is direction and face direction. So it tells you when you're offline. So you're getting a bit of feedback, because when you hit into a net, you can kind of get a sense of that, but because you don't really get a sense of ball flight, you are using then what I do anyway. And some people might just hit and hope, that's a good contact, next ball. I'm using the data I'm getting from the connection to the phone to see, firstly, distance traveled, see that, secondly, a bit of curvature, but I'm using it to confirm what I feel. So I'm hitting the shot and I'm thinking to myself, right, I reckon I've hit that right, and it's a less than perfect contact, which shouldn't have gone quite as far. And I'll look down to see what the data's giving me, to see whether that's what my perception is then backed up by the data, as opposed to just looking at the data and going, how far did that go? So I'm trying to use it using I guess an action fidelity and a specifying information perspective, because the information for me is in the swing. I'm trying to attune my awareness of where the club face is pointing at impact and the quality of the impact to determine A, distance traveled, and B, direction of ball. They're the two parameters that this particular little piece of technology gives me. So I'm using it in a way, but I'm not allowing myself to just be a slave to the numbers. I'm trying to still tap into my own perceptual awareness and use the numbers as either a confirmation or something else. How does that play, Rob, in the use of technology and representativeness standpoint?
Yeah, I think that if you have access to things like that, I think it's a great opportunity to kind of play around with a bit of more, we might call knowledge of performance feedback, instead of just focusing on the results. And I think, you could play around with, how does my movement relate to these kind of variables when I do a wider stance in golf, or I close up. This is some of the thing that's been big in baseball. We've been doing for a while now with pitchers. If I change my grip slightly, how does it change? But I think you're right. The key is being careful with that, about when you use it and how you use it. And I think the way you described it, and also just kind of using it not getting it every time, using it. We as a general rule, if you let people pick when to get their feedback, they seem to get it in the right times, right? That's what we find. Usually it's when you make a good shot, right? You want that feedback to kind of confirm that. Yeah. So I think that's and that's also a great, I think, approach for remote coaching.
Yeah.
Right. If coaches can get access to these kind of variables and measurements, and I think that's an opportunity you can dig into a little bit deeper. Yeah.
It's really interesting for me because, like you say, I'm access to anybody else, so I'm just trying to tap into, my own information. What I've been working on, is to look at the way of developing power. So I've been experimenting with different ways of delivering the club, and then it feels to me like, wow, I've really hit that well. And then I'll look down and go, wow, yeah, that really has gone further. And now I can play within that parameter of, right, I'm releasing the club like that. Okay. I'm not bothered about where it goes. Now, if I was on a range and I could see the ball flying, I would watch where it went, and I'd probably get a bit discouraged by the fact, oh no, it's gone miles right, that's no good. And it would make me control. Whereas ironically enough, the freedom of not having ball flight, but obviously just allows me just to literally blast it into a net and then just be right in the moment of the impact. Yeah. Which is quite interesting. You've got a golf course, Marianne, so you've got all the specifying information you need.
I want to be on my horses. Golf course. If I can just add a little bit here, one of the things that I've been encouraged by is some of the tech that's been used, in particular, for example, in equestrian sports, to do things like help riders be aware of the amount of weight in their hands, for example. So if they're pulling really hard or pulling differentially between different hands, which we tend to because one of them is more dominant. And this so in tech, instead of actually being used to sort of reduce exploration or movement patterns, is being used to help support that perception action coupling, support a recognition of developing feel, if that makes sense. And I think that's really good, and that's probably more what you're talking about there, Stu, isn't it? So
yes, proprioceptive perception.
Yeah, so tech can really help. It's a long word.
Yeah.
So I think there's some amazing stuff that it can support and get us to maybe help that perception action coupling in a way we've never been able to do before, which is exciting.
That brings me back to Joey's question about the wall and the ball, because again, the feel, the touch, and the perception action relationship between ball and feel for a specific purpose, we can use that, in the 1v0 scenario. You can. I'm in a 1v0 in golf, or you're always in a 1v0. You could argue, but the course and the wind conditions and everything else, they're the other variables that don't exist. I've only got a net, so the only place I can put myself is there's not really a great deal of decision making to be done in terms of which club to hit, what shot to do, all those other factors, lie, and all those sorts of things. But what I have got is feel.
Yes.
And delivery. And so in a similar way, in the 1v0 with the wall, that's a place you could place somebody to create that sense of absorption around the task being designed around how does it feel when this ball comes off the wall and you play with it with your foot. What do you have to do? How do you have to move? How do you have to? So there's still an element of that. Again, this is a very, very thin slice of the game, but it's still, got some, it's tasty and it's got some nourishment to it, hopefully.
Yeah. Sometimes it allows us to spotlight stuff though as well. Sorry.
No, go. I think it's it's kind of focusing on the other half of the perception action loop, right? We focus a lot on how information drives our movement, and we play around with distances, spaces. This is what we were talking about here: is how does my movement change the information I get as feedback? Yeah, which I think is a good. You're right. It's a really fine slice, but it's something we don't get a lot of chance to focus on specifically. Yeah,
it's the acting to perceive bit, isn't it, as well as the perceiving to act bit.
Yeah.
And the problem, I suppose, too often for me is that's where people start, and they never really go beyond that. Mm-hmm. So for me at the moment, because of the limitations, I'm trying to create a sense of realism by either using a simulator or these other data sources, but not being a slave to that. But in this scenario, there's you that's just the situation that you're in, so you're making the best of it. The problem is that I think people will do that or mindlessly do it. So there's a big difference, I think, isn't there, between I'm doing this in order to develop this action and to experience stuff about it and to almost be what you said earlier on. It's like diagnostic, Rob. I'm like doing self-diagnostics. I'm going, I did that. That didn't really feel like it was getting to me where I need to get to. Now I need to try something else. Now this feeling's interesting. Let's explore that more. So it's a constant process of experimentation, as opposed to, the hope process of I'm going to get a ball, I'm going to hit it. Oh, that went well. Oh, that didn't go well. But not really any process of working through why it might do it and why it might not do. And likewise, I think that can be true of when you see these, very repetitive activities where there's cones being used to direct traffic. There's no thought process or even anything created around a task. It's purely repeat the movement, and that's a fundamentally different thing because it's a mindless activity.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and hopefully it also develops some kind of couplings, and it makes you more adaptable later on. And whether it's probably not on a conscious level, but you learn when I put my grip like this, it makes the ball go off to the right. You're on a golf course, you're stuck behind a tree, and you have to, you kind of have learned this. You've learned the relationship, better understanding of the relationship between your movements and the outcomes. In particular, not so much just the results, like you said, Stuart.
I was playing around the other day with I think I might have mentioned this last week, but I was playing around the other day because I was on talking to my golf coach, who is famed. In fact, he's infamous actually, and very nearly got struck off by the Professional Golfers Association for. He talks about hitting an intentional shank. Now, for those of you who aren't golfers, it's when you hit the ball off the hosel and it goes almost directly 45 degrees right? Yeah. So it's the thing that all golfers try and avoid, like the plague, because it's like there's like the mythology about it that like, oh, if you hit the shank, the shanks, you get the shanks, you can never get rid of them. Mm-hmm. Well, he's saying, well, if it's skill, right, you should be able to do it intentionally, and then you can not do it intentionally, right? Yeah. So it's a skillful idea, right? So he's trying to hit, and honestly, I was stood there trying to hit a shank and hitting it out the middle of the club and getting frustrated that I couldn't hit a shank. Mm-hmm. And then I did, and it went into the neighbour's garden. But that's different. But the point being is that that's the point of trying to play around with, like, extreme movements. It feels so extreme to try and hit the club there. Mm-hmm. Really strange. How it feels like such a big movement, and yet it's such a tiny movement. Mm-hmm. So it's just trying to play with those sorts of things.
Yeah, we were actually talking about this in a couple of weeks ago when I did one of these on baseball paper. We were talking about hitters getting fooled. Like you start moving like it's going to be a fast pitch and it's a really slow one. So this happens in cricket too. I'm sure way out front. But we were talking about maybe the benefits of deliberately trying to do that in practice, right? And it goes back to something deliberately trying to make a mistake and correct for it, understand how to produce the mistake and correct the mistake in an adaptable way. Yeah.
Oh, go on.
Go on, Marianne.
When you do that deliberately, you're still exploring that perceptual motor workspace, aren't you? You're still exploring those things that you can do. And just going back to what you say about so what people do as training, loads of people who do stuff that in adventure sports that are balance orientated will spend their time slacklining, for example, which doesn't look like any of the other sports, but what it does do is help them explore those extremes of being in balance and moving and it's fun, obviously, but it sort of really helps with that whole dynamic of being able to move in and out of balance and, on small balance points and things. So sometimes what we can use might not have the external perceptual information, but it's about exploring what our capabilities are in action and movement so that we're more confident, which the parkour, we spoke a little bit about that, didn't we, when we talked about the parkour? Mm-hmm. That feeling confident in that you can push your body into a different place or a different space or a different balance.
Yeah, and sometimes it's about pushing yourself to have that feeling of being slightly out of control. Mm-hmm. So you can genuinely explore what you're capable of. So in this particular example I just happened to be using, it feels very out of control. It feels very strange to actually develop club head speed. But that's because I'm so used to holding on for grim death because I'm desperately trying to control the ball from not disappearing into the long grass. Mm-hmm. But if you want to develop club head speed, you've got to have a feeling of being slightly out of control because it does feel like that because, and it's probably the same with baseball batting when they really hit it. I mean, there's a real sense of it's right behind me for a long, long time and it's not going to catch up, but then it does and the thing disappears for miles. Very similar idea, but it feels very counterintuitive. So you've got to get used to these counterintuitive movements, I suppose. And one of the ways of doing that is to place yourself in real extremes and go, wow, that's a strange sensation. Oh, that's interesting. I've discovered something about that. Now I come back to this. What's the difference? What's the comparison? You did a great podcast about that, I seem to remember, Rob. I've lost track of which number it was.
Me too. Yeah, I think so. I think there's a couple. One of them is if there's something you can amplify, kind of. Maybe you don't want to call them errors because but amplify extreme aspects of your technique. Yeah,
I think again, thinking some of those other sports that if you can do that, if you can come back from it. So if you do start to lose balance or end up going into a place that you don't want to be and you've practiced being in that space and coming back again, so coming out of balance and regaining it, for example, that's really important. There's no point only knowing how to stay in the right space and not being able to Snoopy. Mm-hmm. Not being able
we develop we all develop, don't we, a movement repertoire.
Yeah.
Because that's how we learn to navigate through the world. And then we're presented by a different problem. And that asks us to then move in different ways in order to extend our repertoire. And initially, we may not have the solution. So by exploring what the possibilities are, taking us beyond our boundaries, that might help us then to discover more about what the potential opportunities there are here. Hence the idea of, you might use a tennis ball in the wall ball game instead of a football because it's so much smaller. Mm-hmm. But you have to then use really micro adjustments of your foot to control a tennis ball. And likewise, I played a game, a field hockey game, where we were playing field hockey squash. Mm-hmm. Now, this was really just, a game about let's get a ball roughly the size of a hockey ball bouncing on a hockey stick. Hockey balls are too difficult. They don't bounce back. So we use a tennis ball. You get a bit more bounce. Mm-hmm. But that was really the idea of controlling the ball in midair, which does happen quite regularly, but it's also very challenging on different sides of the body. But it was amazing the sorts of skills that my son developed pretty quickly by being able to play a ball in midair. And it then encouraged him, and I posted a bit of video about this, it encouraged him then to go away and play on his own, hitting the ball against the wall, lifting the ball on the wall, trying to control it in the air, because he discovered a game against me and he wanted to get better at it. So that was a way of kind of replaying it backwards for him.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Mary.
Are you sure? I was just thinking, actually, because one of the other things that this helps with is changes. So, for example, growth spurts or having an injury, or moving into an adult version of a game that maybe's got slightly different constraints, that those things are also supported, having gone through all sorts of exploration of what may or may not be correct and pushing those boundaries.
Yeah. And it reminds me of, Stuart, there's kind of two different versions of baseball that people play. Stickball, where you use a broom, so you have a super small, narrow thing to hit with. And then wiffle ball, where you use a ball with a bunch of holes in it, so it flies completely unpredictably as a pitch. So I think I think so. I saw someone post this, I can't remember where, but sometimes I think we can learn just by watching. Kids figure a lot of this stuff out on their own with creativity and how to keep things fun, engaging. So I think sometimes we can learn a lot just by watching what games they come up with too.
I suppose, though, that is one of my fears a little bit, is I wonder whether so much has been put on a plate, and I actually have this worry myself sometimes, is that because I'm the game designer, that I've almost a little bit robbed them of that opportunity and creativity. Fortunately, my daughter's great at this. She'll come off and she'll develop the most convoluted game rules. It takes her about 5 minutes to describe them all to me, and she loses me after about 5 minutes. And I'm like, okay, let's play that game then. And then off we go and we play that. But I'm a little bit worried that, particularly with video games where it's kind of mapped out a little, not always, but there's a bit of that there's a part of me that they're losing the opportunity to go into the space and be creative with what they have around them. And in many ways, again, if there is some silver linings to be drawn from the situation we currently find ourselves in, is that children are in gardens or wherever they are creating stuff, hopefully.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Not inside. Yeah. Playing something someone else created. Yeah. So I think we're getting past time here a bit. So maybe can we end on, one, if you have any last points or tips for someone that's, struggling with the training at home and how to go about it. I know there's one of the points about this, there's no one answer, right? It's about being creative and trying different things, but any kind of last messages you have for maybe Stuart, do you have any last thoughts?
Again, I think it's, I think your point you just made there, Robert, really, which is like, tap into your inner child. If you're the adult who is helping with the design, play, and be playful. One of the things I really like about working, ecologically is, you're encouraged to be playful. You're encouraged to explore. You're not likely to get it right. You're not likely to, and you're definitely not necessarily going to get it wrong. You can just be playful, right? And just to play. I mean, I guess my tip is I always just use a really simple framework, which actually is a framework that implies when we talk about providing inclusive activity for people with various forms of impairment. But it's been around within a constraint space for a long, long time. Step, space, task, equipment, and people. Well, we're often limited on people. And therefore, what equipment can we use? How can we define the task, and what space can we manipulate? And you've got this endless variety of possibilities. All these different games that you can play. We played today. We played again. This is just literally about physical activity, nothing else really. We played the non-Easter egg hunt today, which was some little floppy foam discs that I've got that I've put numbers on. and I hid them around the garden, and they had to collect them in number order at a certain color. And that lasted a good hour. And, that was just about running around and trying to beat the other person and trying to find stuff and be a bit creative. That was just a little activity, right? What about that was interesting? Nothing about a bit of problem solving, a little bit of an idea, but it's just about being playful with what you have in front of you. So that's just a thought I was wanted to share.
Yeah. Marianne, do you have any?
Yeah, I think to follow on from the last 2 points that you guys have come up with. I always think that ideally I might be the person who shapes a session to begin with as the adult or as the coach. But part of what I'm doing is I'm shaping something that I am trying to let go of. So it goes into a bit of co-creation, and my ideal coaching scenario is always when I feel like I'm in their session at the end. And that they play and carry on playing and doing stuff. So, So my mom always used to go, that's not really a proper job, is it?
There's no more important job in the world, in my view, now, especially.
Right now. So it doesn't stay my game. The whole point is that I am opening up an opportunity and a structure for if it's kids or adults, because I always think it's more important to get adults to play almost than kids. They need to learn how to play again. I'm always delighted if I can get loads of people my age to tell me that then they don't play. A space that feels safe enough, and a lot of the time that is about taking away these prescriptive ideas and unlocking the psychological constraints they've got about what they should or shouldn't be doing, so they can just enjoy it and play again. But yeah, it's the game. It should pass from being shaped by me to being shaped by whoever I'm with, if I'm doing a good job. That's always in my head.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And Joey, I think, had a comment about autonomy, ownership of it. I think, we all recognize how that's important. Well, thanks, guys. Hopefully you continue to have fun in your backyards and playing around. We're doing the same here. Hopefully it doesn't last much longer, though. We can get out from the backyard. But
I'm looking forward to Stuart and the others being able to come over and have a go of do some practical sessions.
There you go. You have lots of potential golf coaches, I think.
Oh, I know. Yeah. There's all those cycle tracks and so lots of fun. Sort of parkour spaces.
The important thing I think just to stress there is you can either look at the situation you're in and see it as a really limiting factor, or you can see it as a really good opportunity to challenge not only your own creativity but also to tap into the just as Marianne said, it's a beautiful way of saying it. You're just a starting point and you want to let go of it. I think you can look at it that way, and I've tried to look at it that way, and I'm discovering some interesting things. So yeah. Yeah,
no, I agree. And sometimes I complain about the words we use in this area, constraint. But one of the words that's perfectly named is affordance, right? Yeah. It's a lovely word. It's, the opportunities for, I really like that word. And every situation has affordances, even really constrained, difficult ones like right now. Yeah, I think that's Gibson.
We want to afford people to find that joy in movement again. For me, that's the thing, to want to do something at whatever level they're doing it.
Okay. Thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Okay. That's it for today's episode. Thanks for the fun discussion, guys. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter @ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.